How's it going, everybody? My name is Jacob Glass. Thanks for joining me. Today, I wanted to start a new series, a Bible study series over the book of Daniel. So if you're anything like me, when it comes to Old Testament scriptures, you can get really lost in the context, the characters, understanding what in the world is going on, right? You try to listen to it and read it, try to figure out what you're supposed to get from it. A lot of times you're just looking for the spiritual aspect. But when it comes to actually knowing what's going on, if you're anything like me, you get lost very quick between all of the names and all of the places. So today I wanted to start this series giving a little bit of context to the book of Daniel and going through Daniel chapter 1. So bear with me while I try to work out some of the technical things, getting the book pulled up and the presentations pulled up. I did prepare a little PowerPoint, as well as I'm going to share my screen and try to read some of the verses off for you. So a lot of times I get kind of lost with where I'm at, so bear with me and we'll get started right here. So, Book of Daniel. All right, so like I said, I wanted to give a little bit of context, so I figured it would be great to start with world history prior to and during the time of Daniel. So the biggest player in the story, obviously, is Israel. So if you don't know, there is a period of time, and you can read about it when it first started in the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles, about the split between the northern and the southern kingdoms of Israel. So the northern kingdom retained the name Israel, and the southern kingdom became Judah. So Israel's capital became Samaria, and Judah's capital was Jerusalem. So you can already start to probably picture a little bit better context when you start thinking of the New Testament and the Samaritan woman, all of those things, why there was so much history between the two groups, and between the groups of Jews. So to give a little context at how that happened, you would need to read the story in 1 Kings chapters 12 through 16 and 2 Chronicles chapters 10 through 12. And that's just a little snippet of it, but this is where it kind of begins. So a lot of it began with King Solomon and his kids / servants after him. So after King Solomon had died, his son Rehoboam was the rightful heir to the throne. So the story with Rehoboam kind of goes, he had the nation of Israel come to him and say, your father Solomon placed a yoke upon us, and they were petitioning to him to kind of lighten that yoke, lighten that load. And Rehoboam had a few options. So he went to the older elders who were kind of advising that he listen to the words of the nation and lighten that load on them. And then he had some young advisors that were around him, and they were advising that he doesn't do that and essentially make the load a lot worse. And he decided to listen to the young advisors. So after the 3 days that he was given, he came back to them and he said, pretty much, my dad was bad, but I'm about to be a whole lot worse. He used the term, he said, my pinky is as thick as my father's thigh. So he was saying that he was going to increase the yoke upon them. So obviously that didn't go over very well with the nation. So they went ahead and looked towards a man named Jeroboam. So Jeroboam was one of Solomon's servants, sorry. So there was a whole rift between them, and eventually led to the split of the kingdoms. They made Jeroboam king, and Rehoboam was also made king, and eventually they split into the two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. All right, so continuing on with the history of Israel, what was going on prior to / during the book of Daniel. So Israel, the northern kingdom, they were under the king Hoshea, and he was conquered by the Assyrians in about 722 BC. So that ended up being about 100 years prior to the fall of the southern kingdom of Judah, who fell to the Babylonians. And they fell to the Babylonians in 3 different phases. 605 BC was the first siege, 597, and then 586 BC when it was finally and totally destroyed. So Jehoiakim was the king of Judah during that time of Daniel's exile, which was 605 BC. So the very beginning of the book of Daniel, you'll notice this character, Jehoiakim. So again, if you're anything like me, you start reading Daniel and it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, and you instantly blank and you're like, who in the world is that? So you feel lost. You feel like you can't keep up with the trajectory of this book because you're already lost in the first passages. So let me pull that up just to read that little part. Like I said, bear with me. All right, Daniel 1:1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So Nebuchadnezzar comes in 605, and Jehoiakim was king, and he carries off the first wave of exiles to Babylon. Daniel is included in this. After that, you end up having Zedekiah, who ends up being made king. Not directly after, but Zedekiah was made king in 597, and he was the last king of Judah when it was eventually destroyed in 586. All right, so that was the rough rundown of Israel's part. The next character in this, or the next nation in this that we need to talk about is Assyria. So one second, let me get a drink. All right, Assyria. So like I said before, they had conquered the northern kingdom, Israel, in 722 BC. So Assyria originally conquered Babylon in 729 BC under King, bear with me on my pronunciations here, Tiglath-Pileser III. So they had conquered Babylon in the past. And then, like I said, they conquered Israel in 722 under King Shalmaneser V and carried off Israel into captivity. So the makeup of the nations, how it kind of fell, was 10 of the tribes were a part of the northern kingdom. You had Asher, Dan, Ephraim, Gad, Issachar, Manasseh, Naphtali, Reuben, Simeon, and Zebulun. The southern kingdom was primarily made up of Judah and Benjamin. So one thing that I learned in a little bit of the research that I had done is that after the northern kingdom fell, which, like I said, involved 10 of the tribes, they became known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And the reason for that is they never really retained their tribal uniqueness or their tribal, you couldn't really define which tribes were which tribes were which after that point. Because they got carried off into exile, they lost their, like I said, they lost their uniqueness at that point. And I keep using the wrong word. I mean, maybe there's a better word there. Maybe somebody can help me in the comments what I was looking for. But the only two that really remained after that point were primarily Judah and Benjamin because they were in the southern kingdom. Continuing on, during the Sargonid dynasty, Assyria was at its height. So King Sargon II and his son, King Sennacherib, made Nineveh the capital of the Assyrian dynasty. So that's the same place, obviously, that Jonah prophesied, and that was maybe 844 to 804 BC is the best dating I could find for that. So it probably should kind of speak to you guys about why Jonah was probably so nervous to go there, right? You're talking about the capital of Assyria, a large pagan nation, and you're going into the very capital of that to call them to repent and turn to the Lord. So at least for me, I can definitely sympathize here a little bit with Jonah and why he probably wouldn't want to go there. Like, you're going into the belly of the beast there. So continuing on, Assyria ended up conquering Egypt in 671 BC. And then eventually in 626, there was a revolt, which included both the Medes and the Babylonians. So Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar, which was Nebuchadnezzar's second's father, which is the famous Nebuchadnezzar, the one that we will read about here in Daniel. So his father, Nebuchadnezzar, and one of the Median kings, Sennacherib, in 614 and 615, they led the Medo-Babylonian conquest of Assyria, and eventually Nineveh fell in about 612 BC. And then Assyria was eventually conquered totally in about 609 BC. So after they fell, you did have a remnant of the Assyrian kingdom. So that remnant tried to band together with Egypt, and they tried to retake Haran from the Babylonians, and they ultimately failed. You're going to see that story in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. Necho of Egypt went up there with the king of Assyria, or the remnant king of Assyria, really, and they were going to go to battle with the Babylonians. And you'll see here in a bit that the king of Judah joins in, and he kind of meets a bad end. So we'll continue on. So Egypt. Egypt is another player, like I was just mentioning, Necho II. He was pharaoh from about 610 to 595 BC. He is mentioned, like I said, in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. Made an alliance with the Assyrians. Like I said, bear with me with the name. The king at that time was Ashur-uballit II, and they led, Necho led his army to meet him at Carchemish. While he was at Carchemish, Josiah, king of Judah, went out to fight against Necho and his army. And eventually Josiah was killed at Megiddo. And that's where, like I said, the 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles mention. So let's take a look at that. Bear with me while I try to get this pulled up. It says, after all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, went up to fight at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out to meet him. But he sent envoys to him, saying, what have we to do with each other, king of Judah? I'm not coming against you this day, but against the house which I am at war. And God commanded me to hurry. Seize opposing God, who is with me, lest he destroy you. Nevertheless, Josiah did not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to fight with him. He did not listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to fight in the plain of Megiddo. And the archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, take me away, for I am badly wounded. So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him in his second chariot and brought him to Jerusalem. And he died and was buried in the tombs of his fathers, and all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. And if we continue on here in 2 Kings as the other account, in his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates. King Josiah went to meet him, and Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo as soon as he saw him. All right. So after that, after Josiah was killed, Judah, the kingdom of Judah, southern kingdom, made Josiah's son Joahaz king over Judah. Necho instead deposed him and took him to Egypt, carried him off in captivity there. And Necho placed Jehoahaz's brother Eliakim as king of Judah, and Necho changed Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. So there's Jehoiakim, right? So now it's starting to all come together a little bit. All right. So Jehoiakim is the first name mentioned in Daniel. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So how did Jehoiakim become king of Judah? Well, he was placed there by Necho, the Egyptian pharaoh, after he placed him there, after he disposed of his brother and then placed him there in his stead. So again, that's happening when Egypt and Assyria are trying to reclaim Haran from the Babylonians, and Josiah went out to stop them and was killed. So ultimately, this is a king who is from Judah, but he was placed there in that spot from Necho, king or pharaoh of Egypt. So things should start to be kind of coming together a little bit better now as we're going through Daniel. So let's continue on. You can drink water as well. All right, here's the big one, right? Babylon. So, like I mentioned before, Nabopolassar, he was the first king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and it conquered Assyria in 609 BC. So that's where I just mentioned they took Nineveh, and then they eventually conquered them through the Battle of Carchemish, and eventually put an end to the Assyrian revolt when they met with Egypt and tried to retake it. After that, in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar II, which is Nabopolassar's son, became king, and he invaded Judah, the southern kingdom, in 605, and the first wave of Jews are deported. And we see that in the book of Daniel. We'll get there in a bit. Then in 597, he came back again, and Jerusalem is conquered, and the second wave of Jews are deported. So this was happening in waves. So he didn't just come one time and destroy Jerusalem and carry every person off. I know a lot of people tend to think that. Usually they use the date 586 because that was the final date. But in 586, Jerusalem, the temple, and the city walls were destroyed completely, and the last wave of Jews are deported. So 3 waves. And then after Nebuchadnezzar II, Nabonidus became king. But, and the stories are kind of weird here as to why exactly he did what he did, but Nabonidus eventually went off into Arabia, and he left his son Belshazzar in his place, which is a very similar name to what Daniel's eventually named in the book of Daniel, but it is a little different. So this is that other character in Daniel we end up seeing, this other king, Belshazzar. In 539 BC, Babylon will eventually fall to Cyrus the Great, king of the Medes and the Persians. So it's another king that's mentioned in the book of Daniel, so I thought it was important to place that in here. And Belshazzar is slain in that siege. You see that in Daniel 5:30. So when Cyrus eventually takes Babylon, Belshazzar is slain. So the king's son, Belshazzar, again, Nabonidus was technically king, but Belshazzar was left in his place. Belshazzar is slain in the siege. So he's the one who sees the writing on the wall. Daniel's prophesying about that. So let's take a look at that passage real quick. Daniel 5:30. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. Like I said, the context to that is he was reigning as king in his father's stead, which I thought was pretty interesting to see. So let's continue on. And then we have Media and the Persian empires. So, like I just said, Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC. He eventually would go on to give orders for the Jews to return in 538 to rebuild their city, the temple, and the walls. And you can see that in Ezra. So let's pull that up real quick before we move on. A little too far. It's all right. I'm trying to get this pulled up. Ezra 1, verses 1 and 2. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. What in the world? Sorry, this is all kinds of messed up here. There we go. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. So Cyrus gives this order, and after Cyrus, a character named Darius takes over. So this Darius is, again, there is a lot of controversy about Darius. There seems to be 2 different Dariuses involved in ruling over the Medes and Persian Empire. So the first one, to the best of my ability, seems to be Darius the Mede. So Darius the Mede, from what I could find, most people think he might be Gobryas or Gubaru, who was a governor that was put in place by Cyrus to rule over Babylon. And he began to rule in 539 BC at 62 years old. So the way that seems to have been is that Cyrus obviously remained king over the entire empire, but he kind of put people and governors in certain places, very similar to how Pontius Pilate was put in place over Jerusalem, but he was not Caesar, he was not king. That seems to be who Darius the Mede was. There are a lot of other theories on who he could have been, but to me, that seems to be the most likely of cases. So eventually you get to Darius the Great. So Darius the Great, you see mentioned in Ezra chapter 6. He ended up dying in 586 at 64 years old. So obviously you see the difference between the two. You have Darius the Mede, who began to rule in 539 BC at 62 years old. And then there's a Darius who's mentioned in Ezra, who at 486 was only 64 years old. So they could not have been the same character. So I think this one was probably Darius the Great. He also allowed the Jews to continue their work on the temple and the city. So after the Jews had returned, they were dealing with the groups of people who had lived there while they were dispersed, who kept stirring up controversy and kept putting a halt to the rebuilding of the temple, rebuilding of the city. So Darius the Great re-looks into that. He finds the decree of Cyrus, and he allows them to continue working on the temple and the city. After Darius the Great, you have Xerxes the First. From what I could find, most likely, there is a character that's mentioned in Ezra. Again, bear with me with this name. Ahasuerus. I don't know about that. This character is the king that was mentioned in Esther. So a lot of people think that Xerxes the First, which is Xerxes the Great, was the very king that's mentioned in Esther. So you have this Persian king that Esther ended up going through all the tests and whatnot to end up becoming in the place she was at to save the Jews, right? Rising up to the position she ended up rising up to. After him, we have the mention of Artaxerxes I, which you do see that in Ezra as well. And he allowed, again, the Jews to continue working on the temple and the city. So again, you have these issues with it kept getting delayed. And Artaxerxes, again, looks back, finds the decrees, and lets them continue to work on the city. Eventually, the temple's finished in 516 BC, 70 years after its destruction in 586. The Persians eventually become conquered by the Greeks under Alexander the Great in 334 BC. So obviously that's a little bit after the time of Daniel. Most of this stuff is, but I thought it was important only because of a certain amount of the kings that are mentioned in the book of Daniel, trying to differentiate who it's talking about. So a lot of people can get confused when you read about the Darius in the book of Daniel, and then you read about the Darius in Ezra, and understand that they're both Mede/Persian Empire. It's very easy to think that they're the same exact character. But from the details in Scripture, it does not allow that to be the case. They have to be two different Dariuses. Like I said, the identity of Darius the Mede is up in the air, whether it's Gobryas. Some people think it might be Cyrus, just another name for Cyrus. Do your research, figure it out. I think it's most likely that Darius the Mede was a governor who was put in charge of Babylon while Cyrus ruled over all the nation. So let's continue on. We're here at Daniel. All right, so this is just a quick summary going over what happened in Daniel and going over some of the high points. So we start off in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim. Jerusalem was besieged by Nebuchadnezzar II and the Babylonians. Like I said, that was 605. King Jehoiakim, the royal family, and the nobles of Judah were carried off into Babylon. So they were carried off in that first wave. So 605 comes, remembering that Jehoiakim was put in place by Necho, the Egyptian. Nebuchadnezzar takes King Jehoiakim, takes the royal family, takes the nobles of Judah, carries them off into that first wave of exile. Other things that were taken were the temple vessels, and they were put in the treasury of the Babylonian gods. So I wanted to put a few of these gods here because it kind of gives you an idea, number one, of who they were worshiping, what their gods were like. And here in a second, you'll see how they change Daniel and his friends' names to honor those very gods. So these Babylonian gods would be Marduk or Bel, as they kind of find those a little bit interchangeable. E or Sin or Aku, Shamash, Ishtar, Adad, and Nebu. So just a few of them. King Nebuchadnezzar requested Ashpenaz, who was his chief official. He wanted him to find some of the best sons of Israel and prepare them to serve in the king's court. So what he ends up doing is he takes these very people he carried off in exile, the royal family and the nobles, and he was going to indoctrinate them into the Chaldean/Babylonian culture. So he says, go find these young men, right? Some of the best of them, right? He didn't want the bottom of the barrel. He didn't want his servants to look weakly and have issues with them. So he wanted the best of the best, the spotless, the pure. So he ends up obviously choosing Daniel, as we see here in a second. But for 3 years, the youths were taught the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. They were fed choice meat, and they were assigned new names, namely names that honored Babylonian gods. So you have Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah. So Daniel, originally, the name means God is my judge. And it became Belteshazzar, which means Bel or Marduk, protect the king. So you see that change there. You have God is my judge over to Bel, protect the king, right? So names are now honoring the Chaldean gods. Mishael meant who is what God is, became Meshach, which is who is what Aku is. So this one is like spot on, right? You can definitely see how it was taking what was a great and holy name and changing it to honor pagan gods. Hananiah meant Yahweh is gracious, became Shadrach, which means command of Aku. And Azariah, which was Yahweh has helped, became Abednego, which is servant of Nabu. So, like I said, they were indoctrinated in literature, language. They were supposed to be fed the meat and the drink of the Chaldeans, and they were given new names. After 3 years, after they were to finish that, they were going to enter the king's personal service. So continuing on. Daniel refuses to eat the king's choice food and drink, that he may not defile himself. And he sought permission from the commander of the officials to abstain. So that was Ashpenaz. So he went to Ashpenaz, was refusing to eat the food and the drink of the Chaldeans. So one area where I think was very helpful for me to understand maybe what Daniel was thinking in refusing it. Some people think it was because of the kosher laws. I don't necessarily think that. I think it was something else, primarily what we're about to see here in Proverbs 23. So let's read Proverbs 23. I think it gives us a better insight into what Daniel probably was thinking, because Daniel probably knew these scriptures, and he was probably using it as a guide as he was going through this training. So let's go to Proverbs 23. Again, bear with me. This thing is not wanting to work with me today. Proverbs 23, verses 1 through 8. When you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are given to appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. Do not toil to acquire wealth by discerning enough to desist. When your eyes light on it, it is gone, for suddenly it sprouts wings, flying like an eagle toward heaven. Do not eat the bread of a man who is stingy. Do not desire his delicacies, for he is like one who is inwardly calculating. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. You will vomit up the morsels that you have eaten and waste your pleasant words. So I think Daniel probably understood that it was not the plan of Nebuchadnezzar just to be nice to them. This was all a part of indoctrinating them into the Chaldean culture. And I think the reason he didn't want to do that was that he was not allowing himself to truly be indoctrinated. He was retaining his Jewish heritage and his faith as a child of God. To accept these things as if they were good things, he's saying that the king would eventually turn on him. His desires are not really for Daniel's good, but to indoctrinate him and turn him into a Chaldean, to turn him to a person who would worship pagan gods, most likely. So I think that's actually probably what he was refusing it for. Maybe wrong. Like to hear what you guys say. So continuing on, the commander, after Daniel had asked to abstain, he was afraid because he thought when the king would come and see, he thought that all of Daniel and his friends would look way weaker and haggard, and all of the non-nobility youths would look better than the king's youths. And like, that was something that the king wouldn't have wanted, right? He's putting all this time to raise up this special noble class of new Chaldeans. They were supposed to be the best of the best, right? So they were to go out into the countryside, into the nation, and they were to be better than all of the other non-nobility. So if you had the non-nobility looking healthier than the nobility, right, they would start to question the king. So Ashpenaz, the commander, right, the chief official, he was scared that Nebuchadnezzar would kill him, right? He was scared he would have his head. But God granted Daniel favor and in the sight of Ashpenaz, and Daniel had proposed a test, right? So Daniel said he and his friends would only eat vegetable and water for 10 days, and then they would have their condition observed over against those who were eating the better food, right? All the other nobles, because it doesn't say anything else besides Daniel and his 3 friends were going to do this. So all the other nobles were eating all the choice meat and all the choice drink. And he said, well, after 10 days, after we eat only our vegetables and water, take a look at us and compare it to them, see how we look. And after 10 days, Daniel and his friends looked better and fatter than all of the rest of the nobility. So they continued, and they were allowed to continue to eat only vegetables and water for the rest of their training. And God gave Daniel and his friends knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom. And he even gave Daniel the ability to have visions and dreams and to interpret them. So then you have, after the 3 years, the completion of the 3 years, they were presented before Nebuchadnezzar, and nobody was found out of all the youths that were any comparison to how Daniel and his 3 friends were. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in his realm. And then it says Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus, which, like I said before, is about 539 or 538 BC, who's Cyrus, king of the Medes and the Persians. All right, so that was a brief introduction, as well as a walk through Daniel chapter 1. So I hope that helps, and I hope that this series will continue to help as we walk through Daniel, trying to understand the context, the historical context, what was going on, understanding the characters, but then also doing the hard part, right? Digging into the prophecy. What was Daniel talking about? Who were these visions about? And kind of figuring out and putting all the pieces together. So hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you learned something. Like I said, I am not an expert in this field by any means. This is just coming from my research of the scriptures, as well as a few resources I've looked at. And you guys are more than willing to comment if you have any disagreement or anything that maybe I missed, or if you liked it. All right. So like I said, I will continue to try to do these, try to get them out as soon as I come to an understanding and have time to present the videos in a clear and understandable way. So thank you guys for sitting through this with me. Hope it helped, and God bless.